working with your partner, that was probably the most contentious issue at times, was like, oh, well, you're doing all this really great stuff with the company, and I'm running the day-to-day but also managing the kids. That was difficult.
On this episode of Sound Advice, we meet Jim and Danny Mee, the dynamic duo behind international events business Rat Race Adventure Sports. Their business journey has been a wild ride in itself, and today you'll hear how they changed tack to avoid going bust, how they've built a global travel business around the needs of their family, and what it takes to run expeditions in places as far afield as the Namib Desert or the Panamanian jungle. Welcome, Danny and Jim. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having us. Yeah.
So I have to know, Jim, when you started this business, was this just an excuse to visit some of the most exotic and fantastic places, or was there something else going on when you thought, right, this is the business for me?
Well, I have to say that pretty much was the plan. I mean, there wasn't much of a plan. And actually, when I started out, 2004, the plan very much was... I want to climb Everest. I need some cash to do that because it's quite an expensive thing to do. Therefore, I will set up a business. And that was it. And it was kind of simple in its naivety and didn't quite pan out the way that I ever thought it would. And 20 years later, obviously, tipped a lifetime into this thing, and it's kind of twisted and turned. It's been amazing. Never did go up Everest, but that's absolutely fine because what we have done in the interim is obviously gone to absolutely amazing places all over the world. So yeah, there wasn't much of a business plan, I have to say, at the beginning. And I guess in the sort of naivete of youth and bravado, just kind of forged ahead. I'd been working in the events industry. I had a background in events, so it was a trade. It was a professional calling that I had experience in. And I was into the outdoors, and that's kind of how it came about, really.
But the first iteration of the business was quite different to how it looks today. It was more obstacle courses. Tell us about that and why, as you say, in your naivety, but that was obviously the tack that you chose. So why was it that specific kind of travel that you focused on at the beginning?
Yeah, I mean, right back at the beginning, I was living in Scotland. I was living in Edinburgh, and I'd been working for a number of years for Red Bull. And Red Bull was a fantastic sort of crucible of creativity. It was almost like the can-do attitude was off the chart. It taught me a lot about what can be done. It didn't taught me a lot about business. It was very much a marketing job, so it was kind of spending money, not kind of the commercial side. But it was a fantastic kind of proving ground for concepts. And when I left Red Bull and I did some mountaineering and went on lots of different trips, I kind of used that background to maybe sort of engineer what I thought would be a really media worthy and really interesting concept. And at the time, there wasn't many people doing this kind of activity in terms of participants. Even 10K runs and marathons weren't hugely popular with the general public. It was still quite a specialist thing. So that first event was called the Rat Race Urban Adventure, and the idea was to sort of take people, out of the wild places and actually put them on the streets of the city and have an adventure in the city, abseiling off buildings and kayaking down waterways and navigating through shopping centres with an A to Z map and all that kind of thing. It was very exciting, but it was kind of sponsor based. We needed sponsors, to fund that original concept. So the model was quite different behind the scenes, the commercial model. I guess to answer your question, why did I do that? I guess my background from Red Bull was this sort of kind of wacky, so let's do something because it's audacious. I was into the outdoors. I was living in Scotland. Edinburgh was a fantastic city, so I thought I'd kind of flip adventure on its head a little bit and have a bit of fun with it. We were in the city, sort of play on words. We called it the Rat Race.
And then, so Danny, how did you come into the picture? Because you guys met through the business, is that right? Tell me a bit about that.
Yeah, so I joined in 2012. It feels a lot longer. And I came on into the marketing team. My background was in marketing, but in a very different niche. I came from an engineering background, actually. But I had a keen interest in the outdoors. I was a big rock climber, a really keen hiker. So when this job came up, I was like, that is perfect for me. Applied, got the job, and then obviously met Jim through the job. But when I entered the business, so that history, that kind of urban adventure, city-based events was still very much the portfolio. You know, we had an obstacle series with Men's Health magazine that we partnered with. We had another 10K woodland race with Runners World. So they were all kind of very, what I would call standard events. So I came in and that was what I was thrown into marketing. And that's what we marketed for ages. And that's what the business did used to be. You know, and at that time, obstacle racing was in its boom. You know, 2012 was, you know, when Tough Mudder and Spartan came to the UK from the US. You know, we'd ran the Men's Health Series in 2011, and then obstacle racing just got all of this marketing thrown at it by those really big companies, and it was everywhere. And then we saw that growth and we rode that wave for a really long time. But like all trends, they kind of come and they go, and that's what happened to obstacle racing. So we rode it while it was really high, and we did lots of obstacle races. We did, you know, the world's biggest obstacle race, which was down in Stamford. And, you know, that's a much loved event with our customers, and they still ask for it to come back. But once you could see the market change, and that's when we started to pivot away from obstacle racing. And, you know, that's a key bit of my job is keeping track of what people want to do with their spare time. So that's kind of where the obstacle race background is.
Can you explain for our listeners who might not know obstacle race kind of terminology, like what exactly does that mean? If people who are listening haven't heard of Tough Mudder or haven't looked at your website, what is it? Yeah,
obstacle racing, it's running with activities in the way is how I always describe it. So, you know, 5K, 10K, it's a run, and then you have a challenge that you come across, and it could be monkey bars, it can be tire jumps, it can be, you know, massive. So at Dirty Weekend we had huge like water jumps that were like 20 foot into a pool, huge massive structures you can climb. So it's running with obstacles in the way. They're designed to be fun, and it's the thing about it is it kind of means you don't have to be an amazing runner because you're getting a break every so often. So it's meant to be, you know, an accessible activity in that way. So it's not like, oh, I can't run 10K, but I probably could if there were like 20 obstacles in the way and gave me like little breathers. But it's fun. Like that's what it's meant to be. Like it's a fun thing to do.
It sounds amazing and terrifying in equal measure. You said monkey bars, and I'm just picturing myself in the playground trying to like beat my son is 5 and can do it, and I was there hanging off one rung like, help.
It's hard. It's hard.
No upper body strength. And what you were saying about all the new entrants into obstacle racing, like Tough Mudder. Yeah. So that must have made kind of a lot of noise, but increased competition can be a bad thing as well. So did that mean that it was more of a struggle to get people to come to your events?
It kind of worked both ways. So our obstacle races started the year before those big US brands came to the UK. But with that, them entering the market came their enormous marketing spend. So, you know, I cannot tell you how many times I got asked the question, you know, is it like Tough Mudder? And I was like, yeah, it's like Tough Mudder. Like, and you use that to your advantage. You know, if they're pouring hundreds of thousands of pounds into marketing, you know, they're bringing people to the market who are interested in the next obstacle race, which is how we decided to build the world's biggest. So when we put Dirty Weekend together, it was like, this is the obstacle race to end all obstacle races. And it was known, like, anybody who was at that race had done Tough Mudder, they had done Spartan, they were looking for the next thing, you know, this is bigger. So we capitalized on it in that way. But at the same time, it meant a lot of what I call kind of have-a-go companies came to the market and were like, oh yeah, this looks easy. They're raking the money in because you can charge more for an obstacle race than a 10K. There's obviously more in it. But it meant the market suddenly got flooded with, like, you could do an obstacle race every day of the week, it felt like. I remember counting at one time, and I think it must have been around 2017, that there were 300 races you could have chose from in 1 year. And just obstacles, like, before you even got into standard racing. And, you know, to go from, at the beginning, there was 5. You know, there was us, Tough Mudder, Spartan, you know, another event company called Total Warrior and another called Nuclear Races. Like, they were the big players. And, you know, all of us still exist, but a lot of the others have fallen by the wayside because they've come too late into the market, flooded it. There's only so many people who want to do that sort of activity, and they've dispersed into all these different events. And then commercially, it's difficult. You know, obstacles are expensive to build, especially correctly and safely. Insurance is high to get them insured. So, yeah, we had that flood, and then actually after that is when we felt the market start to go downhill, which is when we decided, you know, we probably need to look at bringing some more events into our portfolio that aren't obstacle based.
Okay. And Jim, tell me about that. So the pivot. So you moved away from, number one, the sort of sponsorship model. I mean, I think people were still buying tickets, whatever, but you were fueling the business with the sponsorship.
Yeah.
So tell me about how the business model shifted. So how you make money today, and also like what's different about the events that you offer.
Yeah, I mean, right in the beginning, you know, it was sponsor led. That was the way that we commercially made a profit. We had small numbers of people, you know, we had TV exposure, etc. We then transitioned into you know, the period that Danny was describing there, which is almost like the big obstacle race period where the numbers of participants grew. You know, the price point was such and the number of participants was such that, you know, you really didn't need sponsorship anymore. And that kind of grew in tandem with mass participation sport in general. You know, more people running 5k, you know, people doing parkrun, people transitioning to 10k, to half marathon, you know, getting on their bikes, doing triathlon. Yeah, there's been an explosion in mass participation sport. And as Danny says, you know, that's led to certain saturation, but it's also led to opportunity to change the model away from sponsorship and to go to ticket revenue. So that's where we were at, you know, let's say, you know, sort of 10 years ago. And as that kind of market, you know, got more saturated and waned, you know, we've always kind of had an eye for a new concept. You know, we've always innovated, you know, over our 20 years of existence. You know, we've operated over 500 events, but you know, in terms of the genres, we've always been adventure sport, but we've kind of always wanted to just, you know, keep pushing it a little bit with the concepts. And I think we saw with the large body of people that had then done a rat race event and trusted us as a brand, there was an opportunity to say to these guys, well, look, you know, we're now going to travel the world. You know, you trust us as an organisation. You know, you trust us for a weekend in the UK to come and do something, swing off some monkey bars, you know, and do a massive assault course or something, you know, fairly adventurous in the UK. Why don't you come with us to Mongolia? You know, why don't you come with us to Panama and trek across the jungle with us? We're still going to be audacious. We're still going to keep the concept uniquely rat race, but you know, we're going to go and, you know, we're going to run amok. We're going to go everywhere, and that was the pivot really. And I guess almost unwittingly, you know, we became a travel company. You know, we kind of evolved into doing events on the world stage in a small group expeditionary format, but very much with the rat race brand and the kind of the, you know, the sort of the rat race, you know, kind of quirkiness at the centre of it. And that was the pivot. So it was kind of a conscious move to sort of, you know, move us into a global event product. Less a conscious move to say, right, we're going to be a travel company now. You know, that is just an evolution that has happened because of the product that we've ended up innovating really.
And do you sort of rely on, as you say, your existing customer base coming back again and again, sort of thinking, right, this is the next thing? Or do you rely on sort of winning new customers for new adventures? And if so, how do you do that? How do you get people to find out about you and click that they want to come?
I mean, it's a bit of both. You know, we do have a very, very loyal customer base. And I think, you know, because we've been in the market for a long time, because we've been through a number of different iterations, there is an inherent level of trust. You know, and we saw that hugely through COVID, you know, which was a key sort of moment for us as well. But I don't know, I mean, you know, I don't know if you want to talk about the repeat customers, but it's, yeah, there's definitely people meeting us for the first time, but the base is really, really strong.
I think it's, so we almost have two sides of the business. So we have what we call our UK base events, which are, you know, the heritage events. You know, some of them have ran for like 12, 13, 14 years. and they bring us in the numbers. So, you know, concepts like ultramarathons. We have an adventure event up in Scotland that's 16 years old now, I think. You know, and they bring in the thousands. So those events range from 300 people to about 1,500, depending on what the event is. A lot of our new customers come in through that channel. So we call them the feeder events. So they come in, you know, they spend a weekend with us, they have an amazing time, and then they look for what's next. And that's when they tend to cross over into the international portfolio. And then once we have a customer on an international event, our rebooking rate is 80%. So that's where, you know, so you bring the new customers in through the UK. We do get new customers come in just off the bat through the big international events, but the channel is through the UK. They cross over to international and then they repeat in the international, but that's just growing the whole time. So the UK events actually this year have had, you know, amazing growth, and we're seeing that translate into the international events as well as they move over, as they look for something bigger.
And you mentioned a moment ago, Jim, the pandemic, and obviously that must have had a massive impact on the business. What did you guys have to do to survive? And how did it change, I suppose, fundamentally how you run the business going forward? Were there any lessons that you're taking forward from that time?
Oh yeah, massively. I mean, it was a shocker.
I'm still traumatized.
You know, yeah, we were obviously in mass participation sports, and at that point we had just become a travel business as well. So, you know, sort of two of the hardest industries hit really. But absolutely, it was almost a defining time. I mean, I think, you know, kind of I would say, you know, the first 6 months was absolutely horrific, and it was just about surviving and finding our feet and just understanding what we were going to do. But of course, everyone was in the same boat. You know, we certainly don't have the monopoly on hardship as a business in COVID. But what it did do, and I think it was an absolutely classic sort of case of, if your back's against the wall, you know, you've got to box clever. You know, you've got to think smart. You know, you've got to think your way out of this. And that's what we did. You know, our back was against the wall. You know, we had a lot of events that clearly couldn't take place. You know, money had been spent on promoting and on funding events that just would not take place. We were holding a lot of customer money. You know, and frankly, had our customers not stayed with us in that period and backed us, we would have gone bust. It's as simple as that. And what we decided to do, and I guess the way that we found our feet, I mean, we did lots of things, but one of the key things that we did is that we used the time to do the R&D on these new projects. And I guess we effectively sold, you know, not to be too cliche, but we sold hope. You know, we sold a dream. You know, we said, look, you know, in 2021, okay, in the end it wasn't 2021, 22, 23, we're going to go to all these places and we're going to do these amazing events. Come with us. And people bought into that. They trusted us, didn't they?
Yeah,
you know?
I mean,
and they entered.
COVID for us were, you know, the lowest lows and the highest highs, for different reasons. I mean, like Jim said, you know, we're suddenly being told your business is illegal. Like, you can't have people gathering in the same place. You know, knowing that we'd spent, you know, huge 6-figure sums on events that weren't going to be able. Dirty Weekend, like I just mentioned, is at the beginning of May. So, you know, when lockdown was announced at the end of March, you know, we had hundreds of thousands of pounds in that event. And we were, at the time, we were like, well, maybe that'll still happen. But when it was obvious we were going to have to start cancelling, you know, we pretty much like begged customers. We were like, please just stay with us. You know, we'll bring it back in 2021. And they did. They all did. And like, we definitely would not have got through that if everyone hadn't just rallied around us. And what we did different, I think, is we stayed active. Whereas we furloughed our staff, Jim and I kept running the business. You know, we were at the end of the emails for people asking what was going on. I run the socials with help from my team. And when my team were furloughed, I ran them all and I just engaged with anyone who would talk to us. And of course, everyone was at home. So online communication boomed, didn't it? You were only on your computer. I mean, you could only go outside for an hour. What I had done that year, which I still kick myself for, is I normally order the event medals in quarterly chunks, but to be economic on the shipping, I did them all for 2020 at the beginning of the year. So the only year I've ever ordered like 25,000 medals in one go was 2020, and they were all sat in the warehouse, and I was like, oh my god, I've got 30 grand of medals here.
Do they all say 2020 on
them? And they all say 2020 on them. Like, totally unusable. And I was like, what can I do? And, you know, we had that 1 hour of being outdoors a day, and we had all these medals. And I was like, I'm going to turn every event into a virtual event. So the date it would have ran, I flipped it into a concept where you could earn the medal by doing it in that time you had outside. So, you know, over the week that the wall would have ran, you had to run or walk 70 miles and you would get the medal. And, you know, there was a time when we were sat in our living room with medals everywhere, with people's addresses, and, you know, our son was like putting the stamps on the envelopes, you know, just to, but people loved it. And I've met people. I met someone in Mongolia this year, and when I always ask, you know, like, how did you hear? And she was like, oh, I did one of your virtuals in Australia. She was like, just like, we posted her medal from here to Australia for an event she had done virtually in 2020. But even that had led to her booking the Mongol 100. Yeah. So what was so important is that we didn't lose connection with any of our customers, you know. And we made like big things, you know, Dirty Weekend, we made people build the obstacle courses in their garden and they filmed it and sent it in. We just made a really huge social media activity around it. And, you know, and since then, you know, social media is obviously so important for us anyway, but that level of engagement with customers is so key to, you know, building that trust and making them feel like you genuinely care about them. And that's kind of what we do. And through COVID, that was a lot more poignant because, you know, the support messages that came in were, you know, phenomenal from people. But then when we launched the events Jim's talking about, the high highs that I'm referring to is we would launch events that were just ideas, you know, Jim and Google Maps underline basically. And some of them sold out.
It's a little bit more than that.
It's more technical than that in the end, but that's how they start. Yeah. But some of those events sold out in an hour. You know, we would open it and they'd go. The places would go immediately. And, you know, it was a stock photo, a line on a map, and people were like, yeah, I'm going to come. Like, everyone just wanted something to look forward to. So that's what we gave them. We gave them, you know, all of these adventures to look forward to. And that's really where the portfolio came from, is, you know, that sort of COVID book of dreams where it was like, where can we go when we're allowed to go out again? Yeah. And, you know, that's what we created.
So have you had a massive resurgence then since the pandemic? Because I totally understand what you're saying. I do feel like people just were like, get me out, basically when everything reopened and people wanted to travel. But it feels like then we were landed with a sort of cost of living crisis. There was the war in Ukraine, and then there's also other stuff bubbling around the travel industry, like this stuff about responsible travel, like the ecological impacts, like what are you doing to the local communities? All this stuff, it presumably is stuff that you're dealing with day to day. So how are you dealing with those pressures now? And are you still kind of riding high, or do you feel that there are these challenges are sort of weighing you down a little bit?
Yeah, so I think, you know, in terms of responsible travel and in terms of dealing with people on the ground, you know, we have a really, really strong network of people that we deal with worldwide, and we just physically couldn't do this activity, you know, without good local operators working with us. It's almost impossible for us not to engage with the local community in what we do. You know, so sort of knocking on the door somewhere in Panama and saying, look, you know, I need some maps, I need an operator to work with, I've got this idea, who can help? That's you know, that's genuinely the way that we go about this. So the engagement with local communities is absolutely real. It's rock solid. It has to be, you know, for us to deliver these concepts. And I think, you know, there's a couple of other things to say as well. You know, flying people to places like Argentinian Patagonia or like the Namib Desert, you know, or like northwestern Mongolia, and them seeing it and them engaging with national parks and places that are protected, that are wilderness areas, I find that very positive. It means that these places are more likely to be protected. You know, they're less likely to be mined. They're less likely to be planted for palm oil. And I think for us, I take great pride in the fact that we're showing people almost the fragility of this world. You know, you go to Greenland, you know, and you see how glaciers are receding, etc. It's pretty humbling, and it's just really, really, you know, it's a big thing for people to see that sort of thing. And I think we're kind of, you know, we're providing those opportunities, really a little crucible, a kind of snapshot, you know, into the world stage and what's going on around the world.
Yeah, that makes sense. And do you guys always go on these trips, or do you take turns, and what happens? Because you've got children between you. So how do you balance the travel aspect of life with sort of schools and kids and family life?
Yeah, I mean, that has changed as the kids have got older. So when they were much younger, they're 10 and 7 now. So when they were littler, you know, I didn't travel very much at all. I probably went on 1 or 2 trips a year. I would choose my favourites and go there. Jim's role in the company is to travel. Like, that's his job, is to, you know, he has to put these events on the ground. You know, he has a team, but no one can do it quite like he can, or no one can see things the way he does sometimes. So that's just his role. Like, so he does travel a lot more than me. He is operations based and I'm, you know, marketing and commercials. But since they've got older, we actually made the decision to retire my mum, it was actually after COVID. She was a carer and she really struggled with that work as she got a bit older. So we made the decision to retire her, and she actually now lives with us and helps us with the kids quite a lot. And, you know, I know how lucky we are to have that sort of family help right here. And Jim's parents, when we're both away, which isn't very often, Jim's parents will then also come up and they'll help. And sometimes my sister comes down from Newcastle and she'll help. So we have a lot of family support to help make this work. And I probably travel 7 or 8 times a year now, but we don't actually cross over that much. So normally one of us is at home, and on the off chance we're not, which are big trips. So like next year we're going to Antarctica. You know, we're both going there, and you know the family will rally around the kids. But yeah, they've grown up with Jim traveling quite a lot. They're quite resilient to it, and they're excited about it. And you know that they love telling people what we do for work. You know, it's you know, it's an interesting thing for them to talk about.
Yeah.
Are they at an age as well where you could start taking them on certain expeditions?
I am desperate to put them to work, let me tell you. Joseph, our oldest, he's getting there, definitely. I think in the next couple of years, maybe about 12, I'll you know, stick him on a pit stop and make him, you know, cut up oranges. But yeah, I think, and they're desperate to. They keep asking, and I'm like, you're just too little right now. You know, it's long days. But yeah, as soon as it's practical, I will definitely be bringing them along for sure. Yeah.
You know, that's the amazing thing that we have with this company. You know, the sort of the whole world's kind of open to us, and our kids hopefully can experience some of that as well. And of course, there's practical challenges in them being with us on an event, you know, that we're operating, you know, for paying customers, and we would never jeopardise that. But you know, for them to come and perhaps join us afterwards, or you know, to come with us and tag a family holiday onto a trip, etc. You know, that's absolute gold. And I think we're very lucky to have that opportunity for them.
But Danny, you also seem very chilled out about the fact that Jim is away for a lot of the time. But that must be quite hard, especially when your children were a bit younger and you're left to kind of hold the fort with the business. I mean, obviously, you know that that's part of the job, part of the deal. But like, has it been hard to cope sometimes if he's been away for a week at a time or whatever?
Yeah, it definitely was. So all of that family help that I'm talking about wasn't as prevalent back when the kids were, you know, 2 and 4, or lockdown was 3 and 5. So everyone was here. But when they were little, I definitely, when I was working full time as well, you know, the kids were in nursery. It was a lot of admin to manage, and I did struggle at times, you know. And I think if you talk about working with your partner, you know, that was probably the most contentious issue at times, was like, oh, well, you're doing all this really great stuff with the company, and you know, I'm running the day to day, but also managing the kids. You know, that was difficult, and I think that was probably the hardest time actually. But I think life with little kids is the hardest time anyway. You know, that's the most challenging time. So I think, I mean, people with teenagers tell me different, but I think that those little kids, they take up so much of you. And when you're running a business as well and working full time, it was a lot to juggle. And I think the thing, when Jim was back, he would always make such a conscious effort to take the children off me, you know, in that sort of, you know, he'd come in and, you know, he'd have them, and it wasn't like me just throwing them at him as soon as he walked through the door, but he understood that it was a lot while he was away. So he really overcompensated for that when he came back. You take them out for the whole day, and I would just sit in the house. Like, that was such a joy. So yeah, that was the most difficult thing, I think, about having children and running your own business with a partner who travels a lot.
And I guess I was, and am very, very mindful of that. I mean, as Danny says, we're lucky enough sometimes to be able to go on trips together, because my mum lives with us, and that's an unbelievable gift. Just in terms of the way that our family can operate. But yeah, going on a trip, having these kind of amazing experiences, high-fiving with customers, just being in these places and being mindful that I'm not there, with Danny, I'm not there with the family. And there is a little pang of guilt sometimes, with that. And I think that's why, we know that as the kids get older, we kind of, we want them to be involved in this. We have an obligation to show them what we're seeing, and have those family experiences, together. We had a wonderful holiday this year, actually, earlier on this year in Costa Rica together. It was brilliant to show them a little bit of the jungle. We weren't doing an event, we were there on our own terms, but what we've kind of learned of these places and what we can show them together, is brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant.
Amazing. And have you ever had an event that flopped, like something that you thought was going to be really good and then people were like, nah? And then tell me about that, and also how you recovered, how you got your confidence back after having a flop.
Oh man, Gunpowder Plot?
Well, that was successful in terms of numbers.
Quantified success.
Yeah.
What were you going to say?
I mean, that's the one that immediately springs to mind, which is an event that isn't really like our kind of event. It was called the Gunpowder Plot, and it was in York. And we had this idea that York was where we were based at the time, didn't really have an amazing fireworks night. So Jim was like, well, why don't we do like a 5K run to fireworks? Like, that'll be really cool and different. People would come and do that on the 5th of November. And we were like, yeah, that sounds great. But like, if we just do normal fireworks on the back of it, we'll get more people there. So we used the Knavesmire in York, which is, it's where park runners. So we knew the 5K route would work. And, everyone was totally on board. And in typical British weather, we got apocalyptic rain. So immediately the event village was a swamp. Like, it was muddy, mums were like pulling kids out of bogs. Like, it was just chaos. Everything was muddy. I just remember all this mud. And we had this like fireworks operator, and the Knavesmire was obviously open to the public around the back. And we had a time that so we had 12,000 people there. Like, it was enormous. And probably 1,000 were doing the run. The run was meant to be 45 minutes and do the fireworks after. It was all set to be like child-friendly, family-friendly timing. But the fireworks company couldn't start the run because teenagers had got onto the firing area and they wouldn't leave. We had to call the police to come and remove the teenagers because they were in the firing area. The pyrotechnic guys were like, we can't fire anything. Like, you're going to have to move them. So we're like, half of us are running around trying to find them. We've called the police. They've got to come. And the delay is building. So it's now 45 minutes. So instead of a 6 o'clock start, we're at 6:45, which is when the fireworks were supposed to start. We eventually got that run to start at 7, which meant the fireworks got pushed back to 8, which is just a bit late when you've got, 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, and it's a school night. Like, I remember it was a Sunday evening.
Very cold, yeah.
And it was freezing. Everyone's covered in mud. It was just like chaos. You were literally watching the event disintegrate before your eyes. The fireworks went off. The fireworks were fantastic. They were amazing. Yeah. But it was so frustrating. Like, weather notwithstanding, that event and the fallback in the local press was, next level. Yeah. But that event, you could see it falling apart in front of you because of some teenagers on a field. Do you know what I mean? Something that you could never have planned for. The Knavesmire is massive. You couldn't possibly have fenced it in. And it was just so frustrating. And there was nothing we could do. Like, nothing we could do to stop it apart from find them and get them off the field.
And I think there was nothing wrong with the event itself.
Yeah.
It was just so late, and we were dealing with an audience we weren't used to. Sort of, they say never work with children or animals, but so it was a learning because kind of public opinion turned. It was like, well, these fireworks were so late. You kept people waiting so long, and we got hammered in the local press. For that reason. But I guess it was probably ill-fated from the start because, of course, Guy Fawkes is from York, so we should have known.
that your plot would be foiled.
We never did another fireworks show after that ever again. And even now, if you suggest fireworks in an event, I'm like, absolutely not. I'm scarred. Because...
Oh my goodness, I feel for you because I'm based in York, and I'm Lenave's Murray's
Were you
like
there?
I wasn't there, but I was thinking that sounds like a great idea. I'd book a ticket to that, and then the story unravels, and you're like, actually, that sounds pretty bad. So you said you didn't do it. You basically were like, no, never touch fireworks. So in terms of regaining your confidence, did that give you a knock about like trying new things? Were you like, right, let's stick to our knitting from now on?
It probably didn't give us a knock in terms of trying new things. I think we knew that it was a little bit outside of our general domain, and I think that was what it really taught us. It was like, sort of stick to what you know. I mean, be adventurous with the concept, sure, but our market, was very much a kind of challenge-based customer, not members of the public. Doing something that was bolted on in a massive way, to the sort of the core endurance challenge. So I think had we just stuck with the run
it would
and
have
done
been
that,
fine.
that was more us, So that was definitely the learning. It didn't knock us off the horse, did it?
No.
But we definitely did learn from it, absolutely.
And what about the future? So what are your big ambitions, either for the kinds of events you'd like to put on or kind of new areas of growth? Can you share anything in terms of your strategy or your plans?
Yeah, I mean, I think right now, we're in a really strong position. As Danny mentioned before, these two kind of strands that we have. The core UK event properties, some of which we've run forever, and some of which are new. They're doing really well, and they're introducing us to lots of new customers who again, are joining those very loyal customers in doing these fantastic, global bucket list challenges. And I think, because of that sort of bang crash wallop that we all felt out the back of COVID, it's very much a time of consolidation. It's like we've expanded rapidly in terms of locations. The world literally is our oyster. We're dealing with events in 35 countries on all 7 continents, and I don't think anybody's doing that really, certainly in terms of our genre. So we've kind of reached that point where we could bring on new events, and we are. We're always looking. We're always searching, scratching the surface for new concepts. But right now, we're kind of enjoying the fact that things are pretty stable. And I think any business that can sort of come out of COVID, kind of wrestle the storm that happened thereafter, and be here 3-4 years later saying actually things are okay. I think we'll enjoy a bit of that stability while we can, and just kind of, take a deep breath, think on a bit before we go for the next, grand strategic move.
Just like global domination.
Yeah.
Is this the kind of job that you feel that you could do like forever? I mean, can you imagine yourself being big white beard, still climbing mountains?
There's a few grey hairs there already.
Not you there, Danny.
Yeah, I wasn't pointing at Danny when I said that. I think from my point of view, yes and no. I mean, I think what we do, so a lot of our events, the international events, are fairly expeditionary in nature, which is fantastic, kind of leading from the front and leading groups into places like the jungle or the desert, or the frozen cold places of the world is brilliant. And there is a shelf life on being able to do that, physically. Now that shelf life is way in the future, I would like to think. And it does make you quite conscious of your sort of health and fitness in general, but both sort of body and mind. Even though we run an adventure sports company, we're still busy, living life and looking after the kids and all of those pressures of life. So it's we've got to be mindful of our, I guess, our health and fitness in that. So for that reason, probably on a kind of practical and logistical level, there are people that will definitely be able to do what I currently do better than me, sooner rather than later. There already is, our team are absolutely fantastic. And I think, kind of sitting back and kind of, looking at the train set and moving the pieces around the board a little bit more is probably what I should be doing more of, as managing director and sort of growing the business strategically. And that time will come where I am doing more and more of that. And I think, in general, this chapter of being able to involve the kids and bringing them on board, that's coming. and we're excited for that. You know, we've got to be here for that.
Yeah.
You know.
My daughter keeps telling me she's going to run the company one day, so
she's
just waiting in the wing. She's already the boss of the house, so she might as well be boss of the company as well.
It's funny that there's always this tension, isn't there, that the more successful you become in a business, the further you get away from doing the thing that you loved doing and the reason why you set up the business. It's just like the natural evolution. You end up managing more people and sort of you get off the tools and you're sort of more on the strategic kind of bird's eye view, moving all the pieces around the board. But that is like almost the price of success.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think, you know, it doesn't, I've kind of learned that it doesn't have to be binary like that. You know, when I first set Rat Race up, I think I went from having done a lot of my own personal adventures. You know, I lived in the Alps for a year. I climbed some really big mountains, did some amazing swashbuckling stuff, and then I literally worked non-stop for 10 years. I moved to London for a while, didn't leave the M25, you know, for a long, long time. You know, kind of nose to the grindstone, and sort of put my head up 10 years later and thought, well, actually, hang on, that's not quite the right balance. You know, so to be in a place where we do have some balance, you know, we can go on trips together, we can involve our team, you know, we can do some fun stuff together, you know, we can hopefully involve the family as we go on. For me personally, it's as important to keep the hands on the tools, as you say, to kind of enjoy almost the fruits of the labour, to have these adventures, you know, or else why are we doing it? You know, success is fantastic, but success is measured in many different ways. And lifestyle and the ability to enjoy what you're doing in the here and now, I've learned that is really important.
Can you tell us a bit about your social media strategy? So which platforms are the most important? What's the kind of content? I mean, I imagine just showing pictures of these amazing places is just like bing, you know, like dopamine hit for all your followers. But is there a specific sort of tactic that you use to get people excited about these adventures? Can you reveal anything?
Yeah, so for us, our demographic is a bit older, so older in terms of the spectrum of ages. So it tends to be 35 to 55 is our demographic. And in terms of their social media use, you know, that is primarily actually Facebook still. And that's where we see big numbers come. And second to that is Instagram. We're not on TikTok because that's just below that age range that I've just talked about. It's kind of a younger market. So we have a team who run the social media. I actually run the Instagram account myself because I really actually enjoy that creative outlet. So I create all the content that's on there. I engage with the customers on there. And that is in my world of commercials and, you know, budgets and all, like managing the team. That's almost my little escape on Instagram. And it's actually a way that I stay, you know, in touch with trends that are happening or what people are looking for. You know, ultra running is actually really booming at the moment. So, you know, we've created new ultras in the market, and they're selling so well because running is a trend right now. And you see that on Instagram. Facebook, in terms of content, it's those videos, which I'm sure you've seen if you've been on our social media. You know, we invest heavily in photography and videography because we know, you know, if you don't know what something looks like, why would you go? You know, if you're looking for a holiday, you want those amazing pictures of, you know, the hotel, the beach, you know, that's what sells the place to you. And it's the same for events, you know, where are the people stood? What are they looking at? You know, what's the vista? You know, what's the challenge? What is it like in the nitty gritty? And we have this balance of the shiny promo videos you see, which are put together based on what the challenge is. And we have a couple of freelancers that we use a lot who are excellent. But then we also have that kind of raw footage that we ourselves capture on our phones. And there's a balance. So you've got the shininess of this is amazing, this is what it looks like. And then that really personal touch of this is actually what it looks like in the moment,
what it
you know.
feels like.
Yeah, so, you know, in Panama, you know, the bits of when people are, you know, like knee deep in mud and they're struggling or they're crying, that's our hardest event and it's marketed as such. But the people who do that event want to see that. They want to see what it's really like. Or, you know, if you're in Croatia and you're paddling to Dubrovnik, you know, that POV point of view footage is as engaging and sometimes more so than the shiny promo. So it's having that balance of that real touch point of real people experiences alongside, you know, the big, shiny, expensive video that, you know, sells the event online.
That's really interesting, because that makes sense to me when you're saying it, that you kind of want the authentic experience. You want to see the real thing. But then, like, because otherwise you would just have everything be shiny and pretty and then like, la, 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 it's going to be great. But you want to know that it'll be a challenge, because that's what people are going for, the challenge.
And the engagement with people on social media, not just in the run up to the event. So the way we normally launch an event is we'll announce it, we'll build the hype around it. So, get people really excited, kind of tease the information, tell them how amazing it's going to be, and then open it and people will enter. And then at the event, we always have live kind of coverage. So it's really important, we show what the event is like as it's happening. So we'll have, live coverage through the day, on stories, normally on Instagram, then the roundup post. But once people have done it, it's so important to then engage with them on their own social media platforms. So, if we've been tagged, we'll always like your post and comment. We'll always engage with you, because you're essentially then marketing us to other people, and we appreciate that so much. When someone takes the time to tag us in something, I'll always go through and read it. I'll watch your reel. I'll, if you send me a story, I'm going to reply, that kind of thing. Like, I think that's so important. And even as we grow, and we've grown actually quite rapidly on Instagram this year, I will never lose that bit of it, because I understand. I would never want to get so busy that I wasn't able to give that engagement back, because I think that's really important.
It's such good advice. It takes time to build these followings, and you can't forget that they're real people behind the grid. So you have to sort of treat people respectfully and be empathetic and engage. It's great advice.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing some stories about both with me. For our listeners, you heard it from Dani. Rat Race is on Instagram and Facebook, so go check them out. God, I want to jump on a plane somewhere exotic right now. Thanks so much for listening. See you in 2 weeks for more Sound Advice.